Hey everybody, welcome to Module 10. The textbook, Library Programs and Services by Greenwell and Evans, has two chapters on collections, chapters 5 and 6, on physical collections and online collections. And they do a great job of introducing the types of materials libraries collect. Books, serials, audio, video, databases, streaming services. They also do a good job of highlighting the challenges of collecting in the different formats. They explain how publishing works, and they discuss archives, special collections, and issues of preservation and access. All of that is great, and I hope you'll give those two chapters a read if you have access to the textbook. But for this module, I wanted to talk more about collection development and less about library collections in general. There's a whole class about collection development, which I highly recommend, and I can't cover in one module what that class will cover in an entire semester. So I wanted to offer a unique perspective and highlight what I know best, and that is analyzing collection use, connecting the library's collection to its mission and strategic objectives, and thinking of collection management as one cog in the wheel of total library success. My colleague Mary Kelly and I wrote the book featured on the slide, Making a Collection Count, a holistic approach to library collection management. It's now in its third edition. It focuses on that holistic approach, or as I said, considering how a library's collection helps them meet their mission and their goals. This lecture is a presentation Mary and I have given many times over the years. So let's get started.
First of all, Mary and I created this model. We call it the collection life cycle. And the idea here is that regardless of the size or the type or the mission of your library, all libraries follow this collection life cycle. All libraries that have collections follow this life cycle. So libraries select and acquire materials, they catalog them, they process them, they shelve them. Eventually they become outdated or damaged or irrelevant, and then we go back to selection. So each piece of this life cycle is equally important, and it can be really easy to get caught up in just selection because shopping is fun, right? And ignore the rest of the life cycle. But you can't just add and add and add and add to the library's collection. Eventually you will run out of space. In larger libraries, whole departments may be responsible for each of these different parts of the life cycle. In small libraries, it may be one person that does the whole thing. But the life cycle exists no matter what library we're talking about. The idea is that when we understand the entire life cycle and our place within it, it's easier to manage a collection. That there are opportunities for managing the collection and quality control at every step along the way. A quality collection, and we're talking about making a collection count. A quality collection, you have to pay attention to each phase, or whatever department is responsible for each phase of the life cycle. They have to do their part. If there's a breakdown at any one piece of this life cycle, it affects the other parts. If you think about it, if it's processed incorrectly or cataloged wrong, it becomes really hard to use it, or it's shelved in the wrong place. If you select the wrong things, maybe they'll never be used or checked out. If it's in the wrong kind of packaging, then shelving becomes difficult. So processing and shelving are related. All of these pieces are connected, and we'll see that again at the end of this presentation. The idea here is that by the time you get to the weeding piece of this life cycle, that you've done all that you can do for the materials in the collection. You have bought the right things and processed them correctly, they're cataloged correctly, they're shelved appropriately, they're used and reused and reshelved and reused. From time to time they're repaired or maintained. By the time you get to weeding, you've done all that you can do, that the right things were bought, and used, and all of it. Like I said, it's real easy to get sort of stuck in selection. It's also easy to get stuck between buy it and weed it and buy it and weed it. You have to pay attention to the entire life cycle. You'll notice that I tend to call it collection management instead of collection development. You're not wrong either way. I just like the idea that Collection management implies control and attention, management of the entire life cycle of the collection, where development implies growth. We are not always growing or developing a collection. Sometimes we are maintaining a collection, but we're always attending to our collection. We're always in control of our collection. We're always managing our collection. That's why I tend to call it collection management. Again, you're not really wrong either way. You have to have a collection management policy. A lot of libraries have selection policies, and that's one piece of that collection life cycle. So we want to suggest that a collection management policy talks about all of the pieces of the collection life cycle. The collection policy states how the library's collection will help meet its mission. We don't just have a collection to have a collection, and we don't just have a mission to have a mission. Those things are connected. Everything that a library does, all of the programs that it offers, the services, and the collection are meant to help the library meet its mission. The collection policy states how the collection will help meet the library's mission. Again, you can't just have a selection policy, maybe a weeding policy, and then ignore the rest of that collection life cycle. The entire life cycle should be represented in the policy, as well as all the different collections in the library, the audiences that you serve. Who do you collect for? Is it children? Is it teens? Is it adults? Is it all of those people? Is it law students? Is it researchers? Who do you collect for? And what kinds of things will you collect or not collect? Maybe your collection policy specifically states that you will not purchase spiral-bound materials because they're too hard to maintain. Maybe you'll only buy certain formats. Maybe you only buy downloadable e-audio and you no longer buy books on tape or books on CD. Your policy can talk about genres, formats, specific collections for specific audiences. You can talk about when you will rely on cooperatives and resource sharing. Like maybe you will not buy textbooks, but you will attempt to get those items through interlibrary loan. If your collection management policy uses words like preservation and conservation, I would warn you to be careful that preservation and conservation are not the same thing as maintenance. Leaving dusty old books on a shelf is not preservation. Preservation and conservation are about, climate-controlled spaces and temperature-controlled spaces and handling things, with white gloves or, very specific preservation techniques. If your library is a popular materials public library, you're probably less concerned with preservation and conservation, but you probably will take certain maintenance efforts. Your collection management policy can spell out, how far you're willing to go with the maintenance. If the maintenance effort costs more than the materials are worth, or if they're easily replaceable, or if they're available through interlibrary loan, you're only willing to go so far, to glue things and tape things up in a public library popular materials collection before you weed them. You are probably going to make efforts for fixing a collection. If there's flood or fire or serious damage, there might be some preservation or conservation efforts taken. If you have rare or irreplaceable local history materials, maybe you want to spell out in your collection policy that you will treat those materials differently. Weeding efforts should be talked about in your collection policy, what criteria goes into weeding. We'll talk about that more later in the program. And then we also like to include our holds to copies ratio in our policy, saying that we will attempt to purchase 1 copy for every 5 holds in our system. But we also are clear to say that that is dependent on the format. Audiobooks and ebooks are super expensive compared to their print counterpart. So that holds to copies ratio might be different in different format collections. But we try in general for a 5-to-1 ratio. Some materials are just really expensive. Oversized books or special things that they get really popular all of a sudden, and they're really hard to keep that 5-to-1 ratio because they're just too expensive to do that. And so the collection management policy can say, whenever possible, dependent upon availability and cost per item, that you'll try to make this holds per copies ratio, that you'll try to abide by that. So just some things to consider when updating a collection management policy. And these policies do need to be updated. I would say you get a couple of years, and then you just need to go over it and make sure it's still relevant to what you're trying. So the collection philosophy of a library. I mentioned popular materials. My library is a public library popular materials collection. We are not trying to be a research library. We are not an archive. We have been very clear that our collection is broad. We cover a lot of topics with a couple of items in each topic. We don't go very deep in any one subject area. If you think about some of the special libraries like medical libraries or law libraries, presidential libraries, things like that, they go very deep into one subject. Law, medicine, the president. Where a public library maybe has a very broad collection. We cover a lot of topics, but not very deeply. If well-rounded content is important to you, you want to spell that out. If you want to have, a lot of different fiction authors where maybe you don't buy a lot of copies for popular demand, maybe it's more important for your library that you have debut authors and that you try new things and that you have a lot of different well-rounded content, and that how popular the materials are is not important to you. Our collection philosophy also is very clear about diversity and inclusion. We talk about inclusiveness, diversity, equity, access. All of that is part of our collection philosophy. So I love this idea that a quality collection offers strategies to ensure that learners actively engage with the materials. That's a quote from a school librarian. It's still very relevant to public libraries as well. A collection offers strategies to ensure that learners engage with the materials, that those materials are accessible, that there's a diversity of thought, a diversity of content, that people will use it, that people are interested in what you have to offer, and that they, again, relate directly to your mission. So a collection policy states how the collection will fulfill the mission, but then there are collection objectives which detail the purpose of each collection and the criteria for selection. This is taking things just a little further. Usually your collection management policy is a public document where the collection objectives, it's not that it's secret, you certainly can share it with your public as your library sees fit, but it's meant to be more of a helpful thing for staff to use. It helps staff really hone in on what the criteria is for each individual selection, selection for each individual collection. So let me give you an example. If your collection management policy says that your library is going to purchase audiobooks, which provide access to spoken recordings of print material, you may say in the policy that this might include works of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, drama, foreign language instruction, self-improvement, or instructional material. You may even call out that it may include electronic formats. So that was the collection management policy. We're going to buy audiobooks, here's why, and here's basically what it will include. The collection objective takes it a little further. Objective for the audiobook may say that you will select current fiction titles that are unabridged. Again, we're talking about audiobooks. We will select popular and current nonfiction titles that are unabridged. Already you can see the specifics of what the collection is going to include. Maybe we are going to select classic titles which continually have demand. Not just any old classic title, but those that maybe are part of curriculum, or that your book clubs use regularly, or that just have popular, constant, continual demand. Your collection objective could say that you're only going to purchase the CD format and the downloadable e-audio format. Objectives you can see already, they have to be updated more regularly even than the collection management policy, so that you can keep up with whatever the popular format that your library is going to purchase. Once we let go of those CDs, we'll revise our collection objective to say whatever new format we're going to purchase. Our collection objectives for audiobooks say we're going to give lower priority to series fiction to limit commitments to future purchases. And I'm looking at you, James Patterson and Danielle Steele and Nora Roberts. Those are super popular authors. Your library may want to commit to keeping up with, the bajillion D titles that they publish constantly. That gets really expensive. So if you're a smaller public library that doesn't have the kind of space or the kind of budget that can keep up with those prolific authors, maybe you're going to give lower priority to those series fiction, because once you start a series, you've sort of committed, right? You have to keep up with it. Maybe you're only going to buy the standalone titles that are not part of series for those authors. Just some things to think about when you're writing your collection objectives. Make it work for your specific library's situation. Another idea is giving lower priority to nonfiction titles that will be outdated or irrelevant really quickly. Think about presidential election years. We love the president, we hate the president, we love this candidate, we hate this candidate. There are materials, books on both sides of that. And they become available in audiobooks, and they're super popular for a hot minute. When the election is over, no one cares. No one cares about the guy who didn't win, or the person who didn't win the election. And so those are now outdated and irrelevant. They were very expensive per item because we're talking about audiobooks, which are pretty pricey. So maybe your library wants to give lower priority to nonfiction titles that will become outdated too quickly or irrelevant too quickly. So those are collection objectives. They detail the purpose of each collection and the criteria for selection. We're going to take this one step further. Collection benchmarks help you know if you purchased the right things. A benchmark is a standard to measure or to judge the success of the collection. So you set an expectation for a collection, and then you follow the metrics, you follow the data to see if the collection is performing as you expected. And by performance, I mean, was it checked out as many times? Was it, used? Was it displayed? Was it all of the things around that collection life cycle? Did it perform as it was expected? And keep in mind that those expectations are different for different materials. So we set benchmarks however they are most appropriate for the individual collection. So you might have an item circulation benchmark. You might have a collection age benchmark. Some of those, really timely subjects like medicine and law and, business. Some titles have an age benchmark. Maybe we want our medical collection to have an average age of 5 years. That doesn't mean everything in the collection will be 5 years old. It means the average age. Some are going to be newer, some are going to be slightly older. On average, we're looking for about 5 years in our medical nonfiction collection. You might have a benchmark of turnover within a collection. Some of the really popular collections like fiction or movies or music, turnover is how many times something checks out within its normal circulation period. So if a DVD goes out for 1 week, but it actually, went out and came in and went out and came in, is circulated, 2 or 3 times in a week, that's a high turnover collection. So you could have a benchmark for turnover. And you set these benchmarks, you can change them over time. You might have a circulation benchmark, in the first 6 months that you buy something, you expect it to go out a lot because it's new. Maybe it's displayed in a new book area. And so if it's brand new, I want it to basically be out more often than it's in. So if it's, on the new bookshelf for 6 months, I would like to see 5 or 6 circulations in that amount of time. Once it comes off the new bookshelf and we put it in the regular collection with all the older materials, I don't expect it to perform quite so high. So maybe in years, 2 through 5, we're only expecting 2 or 3 circulations per year or per whatever time period you set that's appropriate for individual collections. So benchmarks are used to compare one library's performance to another library. There's all kinds of national and state statistics about circulation that can help you see, is my collection being used to the standard of other public libraries that are similar in size or similar in audience or geographically to my library. You can compare circulations, library visits, program attendance. There's all kinds of benchmarks that you can set that help you compare your library's performance to another similar library. We're not comparing Detroit Public Library and all its branches to a standalone tiny library in a rural area, because that doesn't make sense. Benchmarks need to be apples to apples. You can also use benchmarks to compare the use of one item in a specific collection compared to another item in the same collection. An example we always like to give is the Dummies Guide series, and then there's the Complete Idiots Guide series. They're a very similar format, they're very similar material. For whatever reason, in my library, people really like the Dummies series. And so comparing the use of, say, the Dummies Guide to Windows 10 or whatever the latest Windows is, compared to the Complete Idiot's Guide to Windows 10 or whatever the latest thing is, the Dummies Guides go out way more. And so we've learned over time to pay attention to those benchmarks. And so now we just buy more of the Dummies Guides and we don't buy the Complete Idiot's Guides. So that's just one very specific example. But we learn what our patrons like. Compare one item in any collection to another item, another similar item in the same collection, so that you know what kinds of things people like. You can also use benchmarks to determine if items in a collection are popular with library users and if they're being used as intended. If children's materials are only being checked out by teenagers, right, then maybe those materials belong in the teen collection. So being used as intended is another way to look at things. Okay. Running reports in your ILS is a great way to see how your collection is performing, but it's not a substitute for physically interacting with your collection, putting your hands on the collection and your eyes on the collection, because reports do not call out condition, right? If you only ever look at how items are circulating or how old they are based on a report, then you don't have any idea of what it looks like on the shelf. You need to have a clear idea of why those items are or are not being used. So we're going to go through some of the kinds of reports that can be really helpful for collection management. No circulation prior to a certain date. Maybe it's 5 years ago or 2 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever makes sense for your library. So the report will list all items that have not been checked out prior to a certain date. Or maybe you want to list all items, and I should clarify that we're talking about all items in a collection. We're not talking about the whole building, right? That's too much to deal with at once. So maybe we're only talking about the science collection or the law collection or the travel collection or whatever. So if we're looking at the travel collection, maybe we want to know everything in the travel collection with a publication date prior to however many years ago, 5 years ago, whatever makes sense for your library. So that's another report you could run. I talked about turnover rate. How many items are marked missing? Do you want to replace those items? Do you want to just get those items, the records, out of the system? So you could run a report of items marked missing. You could run a report of items extremely overdue. Different systems call that different things. My system that my library uses calls it lost. Actually, that's the lost report. It means it's been checked out to someone for so long that we assume it's been lost. Still on a patron's record, and they may or may not get charged for it, depending on if your library is fine-free or fee-free. A lot of libraries that are fine-free still charge replacement costs if for things that are extremely overdue. But you could find out what those items are. Do you need to replace them to get an item back in circulation? Do you just want to let them go because even if it ever comes back, it's so old that you don't even want it anymore, right? So you can make different decisions with different reports. Maybe you want to do a circulation by a call number range. Show me all of the children's 500s, or all of the picture books, or all of the travel books. You could even break that down to an even smaller range. Within the science books, I only want, the 590s for animals, or I only want the 560s or the whatevers. You could do it by a certain call number range. You could do a report of the highest circulating items, because then you want to look at them for condition, or you want to consider extra copies, or you want to promote them on social media as, isn't this cool? This is the most highly requested item, or the item with the most circulations this year. People are just interested in that kind of data. It's kind of fun to share. You can get a report of in-house use. We always suggest that if you find things just laying around on tables or carts, or at the end of a shelving range, someone used that. They took it out of its shelving location. Maybe they didn't commit to checking it out, but their hands were on it because it's not where it's supposed to be. And so in the Circe Dynex system, which is what my library uses, and in most ILS systems, you can mark an item as used. It's not a checkout, it's a use. They actually tally the same way. A use is a use, whether it left the building or not. But you want to get credit, you want to give those items credit for having been used. Magazines are a great example of that. A lot of people do not check out magazines, but they, sit in the library and they browse through. They leaf through those magazines and they, leave them on a table. They leave them on a cart, and then we mark them as used. So we can see which magazines are popular and which ones have never gone out or never been used in a certain time frame. A shelf list, for me, is one of the most useful reports that you can get. And usually I'll do a shelf list of a very specific piece of the collection. I might only do the 970s, or I might only do the 940s, whatever, or maybe just all the 900s. It lists every item in the collection for that collection. And you can see whether they're checked out, checked in, marked missing, all of the things on this page, how many times it's checked out, when was the last time it was checked out, the last date it was checked out, when was it published. And a beauty of a shelf list is it's everything. So when you sort by the different categories or column headings, usually you can export it to Excel and use Excel to sort the data. I can sort it by the least amount of circulations. I can sort it by the most circulations. I can sort it by the oldest publication date or the newest publication date. I can sort it by the most uses, the least uses. You get a different flavor or a different story about how a collection is being used every time you sort those materials. But again, it doesn't just give you those specific ones you're looking for. I mean, there's value in having only a list of the Noakes Circ prior or the publication date prior. There's value in that, but sometimes you want to see how the collection as a whole is being used, how it's shaping up as a whole. It can really help guide you to set or to update those collection guidelines and benchmarks and things like that. So let's talk about sorting. Like I said, every time you sort a report in Excel, you get a different piece of information about the collection. You can sort by title, which flags duplicates in the collection. You can sort by call number, which flags linking errors. Maybe there was a typo and everything else says FIC, FIC, FIC for fiction, and one of them says FAC, right? It flags you to a linking error. If you have a collection code of adult nonfiction 700s, but somebody made a mistake and they called the call number 976 instead of 796, so it has the correct collection code but the wrong call number, you can fix a lot of mistakes with that kind of thing. So with a shelf list and sorting of a shelf list, don't be intimidated by the fact that you're looking potentially at a list of thousands of books, because you can scan it quickly, you can sort it, a million ways, and you quickly see things that look out of place. Let's talk about that circulation metric, because this is a difficult one to define. The word circulation implies a circle that it checks out, maybe it gets renewed, maybe hopefully it eventually gets checked back in. That's the circle. A circulation is a checkout and a check-in. But different ILS systems will count things differently. So if in the case of a renewal, it was checked out, it was renewed once, and then it was checked back in, is that 3 metrics? Does it count as 2 checkouts, the original checkout and the renewal? Or is it only 1 metric, 1 circulation? It went out and it came back in, and that's 1. Understanding how your system counts things can be really helpful. Our system, the Circe Dynix Symphony, has a problem of the idea that you actually check out an item to different statuses. You check out an item to damaged, you check it out to mending, you check it out to temporarily unavailable, you check it out to display. So when we run our monthly circulation statistics, we have to be very careful to remove those specific statuses from the total circulation. We don't want to report to the library board and to the public that we had 1 million circulations in a year, but half of those were checked out to damage or display, right? It's not an accurate portrayal of circulation. So you want to be careful to differentiate when something was actually used by a patron. Even if staff is that patron, that's okay, but was it actually used, or was it checked out to a status like display or mending or whatever? So again, understanding how your system counts things can be really helpful. Okay, circulations over time. Many ILSs will tell you how many circulations an item has had since the record was created. It'll tell you when the last or most recent circulation was, but not many of these systems will tell you when each of those circulations happened, or what kind of a circulation it was, like was it a renewal. A report of every item in a certain collection that circulated last year could be very telling. It could help you find duplicates where the circulations of each copy are widely disparate. Why did one copy circulate 30 times and the other copy twice? Right? Was one of those copies missing for a long time? Was it damaged for a long time? Did somebody check it out and keep it out for 6 months? You need that full story. So circulations over time is a really interesting metric that I wish more ILSs would provide. So items with a really old publication date that have significant circulations. Maybe something is very old and it circulated 200 times. What does that really tell us? It means it's old and that it had a lot of circulations. We don't know when those circulations happened. Did they, 199 of them happen 20 years ago and then it accidentally went out last month? It has a recent last circulated date, but why? Did something important happen related to that item? Like, was there a movie release of an older fiction title and now that older book is popular again? Was there a current event about a place, or I don't know, a natural disaster? Maybe there was a celebrity death, and so, something they wrote or their biography is suddenly popular again. So older items that have a lot of circulations don't tell you a lot. When did those circulations happen, and why did those circulations happen at those times? That's a really interesting number to have. It tells you a whole different story about how the item is being used. Group metrics describe the activity of items as a group. They're used to answer questions like how are youth nonfiction science titles performing compared to the overall performance of youth nonfiction? Right? Is the science collection just really popular, or is it one of the least popular nonfiction collections? Or how old is the youth science collection on average as a whole? What is the average age of this entire group of materials? How does the use of downloadable materials compare to the print materials in the same subject? Do people prefer ebook fiction or print fiction? How does the use of one compare to the use of another? We're not talking about titles, we're talking about a whole group of items. Or maybe even what items are more likely to be stolen or damaged due to their format or their size or their content, whatever it may be. You can look at a group of materials and sort of make some decisions about the materials as a whole. Some group statistics, we've talked about average age, but there's also median age, and you want to use these two carefully and only include similar items, because if you got the average age of the entire library collection, the local history collection is probably bringing that down significantly. So having an average age of the nonfiction 610s, which is the medical collection, or the legal collection, makes sense to have an average age of those, time-dependent collections. Maybe you want an average age of fiction. That's less helpful because we have classic fiction that is still relevant. So only include similar items. This report gives you an idea of how old a group of items skews. So the median age lines up all the items in any one collection with their publication dates and finds the midpoint. So how many items are older than the midpoint and how many items are newer than the midpoint. That's an entirely different number sometimes than the average age. So both are helpful, but they are not the same thing. Relative use is one of my favorite things, and it can be a little complicated, so I'll be careful to describe this one. So a collection making up a certain percent of the total volumes should make up roughly the same percent of total circulation. So here's an example of that. If the nonfiction 500s make up 15% of the total nonfiction collection, not the whole building, but just the nonfiction collection, then the 500s should make up close to roughly 15% of total nonfiction circulation. So I'll say that one more time. If the 500s make up 15% of the total nonfiction collection in number of volumes, then the 500s should make up close to 15% of the total nonfiction circulation. That's relative use. So what this tells you is, if a collection's size is greater than its percent of total circ, then you need to do some weeding in that category. You've got more items than what's going out. If a collection's size is less than its percent of total circulation, you need to add more titles or allocate more budget to that collection because there's more demand than you have items to fulfill. The goal is to balance collection size with percent of total circulation. You have to sort of adjust this for practicality. Sometimes, the local history collection or certain collections You're just never going to match the collection size to the total circulation, and that's okay. There are situations where maybe that doesn't make sense. In general, it's a good statistic to use. Use relative to collection size. And again, be sure to only include related items in this statistic. So those are group metrics. Now let's talk about some item metrics, which describe the activity of a single item in the collection. They are used to answer questions like, how does this title compare to other titles? How old is it? What is its physical condition? Is there an updated edition available of this specific item? Is there a better title available than the one we've got in our collection? So those are some of the questions you can answer with item metrics. And here are some examples of item metrics, starting with cost per use. If you know the cost of an item and the total circulations of that item, you can calculate cost per use. You just divide them. In an academic library, it might be important for you to share the cost per student number with administration. In a public library, you can share cost per patron numbers. We do this a lot with our more expensive collections, like our ebooks and our databases. Like how many uses of a database were there for a year, and what was the cost of that database for a year? So cost per use. Some of them can be quite high. It tells you which items you need to promote a little better, or which items just plain didn't work in your library, so you can choose different things next time. You can include the number of students or the number of patrons in the calculation. Okay, let's talk a bit about physical inventory, which is where you compare what you actually have in your holdings to what the computer says you should have. If your library has RFID, it can make this pretty quick and pretty easy. Otherwise, you run a shelf report for one small piece of the collection at a time, one section at a time. We're not closing the library and counting all the items. That is ridiculous. It's not practical. It's not feasible. So pick a piece, maybe your fiction A, right? And you'll do physical inventory of fiction A. And then you'll move on to fiction B. Maybe you're going to do just the medical collection or the legal collection. So pick a small section, run a shelf list, or gather the data using your RFID system. I always think it's a good idea to put your hands on the item as part of inventory, because it's such a good opportunity to check on condition. Look at the bindings. You also want to look at the record of the item in your ILS and compare it to what's in your hand. Did a large print item accidentally get linked to a regular print record? Did an unabridged audio get linked to an abridged record? It's an opportunity to fix simple mistakes like that. Is everything spelled correctly? Is the format correct? You're looking at the shelf list. Here's what the ILS says we should have. Comparing it to what we actually have, how it's linked, how it's cataloged, how it's shelved, how its condition is, how it's processed, all of that. You can use the help of volunteers and pages to do this kind of work. They can look at a list and see what's on the shelf. Any decision making can fall to whoever the collection manager may be in your library, but I feel like you can use a lot of volunteer help for this kind of a project. So here's what you'll discover when doing inventory, and I've chosen some kind of funny titles to show here. You find those inaccurate call numbers, you find mislabeled items, you find items that are marked missing, you find items that are still checked out on patron records, you find items that are weird. When you are going through and putting your hands on the collection, you get to know your collection a lot better. You see what's actually on the shelf, and you find things and you think, well, how did I miss this through all these years of weeding, or why did we have this in the first place? All right, to wrap this up, I want to remind you that library quality and library success, as we said in the beginning, happens when all departments and the services are considered together as a big picture. That collection life cycle that we talked about. How does each phase of that life cycle or each piece of that life cycle and the people who do the work at each phase, how is their work intertwined and connected? How does a simple error, and you know what, human error happens. There's always going to be an element of human error, and that's okay. It's having the processes and the procedures in place to catch it and to fix it before it becomes a systemic problem, right? If you need to fix your processes, fix your workflows for errors that keep happening constantly, a lot of these reports and paying attention to your collection throughout the life cycle help you to do that so that you can fix it before it's a bigger issue. You can fix a mistake on one item really easily, but when it keeps happening and the quality of your collection is compromised, you want to pay attention. And you want to ask yourself, how does your library's collection help your library meet its mission? That's what it all comes down to. Am I building a collection that matches what my library is trying to do? That's what we've got for collection management. Like I said, there's an entire class on this subject that will go into the nitty-gritty of how to do selection and how to do weeding and all kinds of terms, library finance terms and budgeting and encumbrances and just all kinds of things like that. For the purposes of Introduction to Public Library, I wanted to sort of hit the highlights of collection management, give you some new ways to look at collection management, and hopefully to have you look at it in more of a holistic way. It's not just buying materials, it's not just buying and weeding materials. It's all those other things in that collection life cycle. Hope you enjoyed this topic. Have a great week.